Welcome back, my friends, to Winning Paths, the podcast where story meets sinew, where memory is drawn like breath before a shot, and where we explore not just how we move through the world, but what moves through us. Today's episode comes wrapped in silence and flight. It's a meditation on pain, not the kind that screams, but the kind that settles in the marrow, the kind shaped like an arrowhead buried in ancient bone. We begin on a battlefield in 1346, under skies thick with English longbow fire, where the air turned to snow, not snow that melts, but snow that wounds. From there, we move inward, through ritual, through history, through the phantom aches we carry even after the bleeding stops. This isn't just a piece about archery. It's about what it means to aim at something with your whole heart, about what it costs to hit the mark, and about the wounds we inherit, survive, and sometimes need to name. So take a breath. Sit with me in the stillness before the shot. And listen, because this next hour might just strike something you've been carrying for years. Then the English archers stepped forth one pace and let fly their arrows so wholly and so thick that it seemed snow. When the Genoese felt the arrows piercing through heads, arms, and breasts, many of them cast down their crossbows and did cut their strings and returned discomfited. Jean Froissart chronicles on the Battle of Crécy, 1346, there are moments in history, true enough, that don't fade so much as root, growing into the very bedrock of our remembering. This is one of them, Crécy, the 26th of August, 1346, when the air thickened with the sibilant hiss of yew-driven arrow flight, and the breath of men, caught in surprise and terror, turned to a deadly snow. Not the gentle kind that settles soft on a winter field, no. This was a blizzard of bone-deep reckoning, English longbows, many drawn to 100 pounds or more, singing like 1,000 taut throats from well-ordered ranks, and the Genoese crossbowmen, mercenaries famed for their skill, but ill-suited to the pace and the deluge, buckling under a storm of shafts. Their pavises, their great shields, mired in mud behind them, offered no quarter. Froissart, that keen-eyed chronicler, didn't write in metaphor for elegance alone, though his language has the poet's ring. He wrote because he saw, or heard from those whose eyes still held the horror. Men pierced through the mouth while crying orders, through the unarmoured points where gorget met helm. Shoulders snapped backward by the impact of a bodkin arrow designed to punch through mail, vision blurred by their own blood. It seemed snow, he says, and I believe him. I've stood in enough Irish rain, the bowstring wet and heavy on the fingers, the air alive with the scent of ozone and damp earth, to know how arrows fall, soft at first, a whisper on the wind, then certain, a chilling punctuation to a life. The English archers, many of them yeomen, commoners, were masters of a terrifying volley, loosing perhaps 10 to 12 arrows a minute, the rate the slower cranking crossbows could never match. Come back to this, not as a historian with a sheaf of footnotes, though the archives have their own solemn music, but as a man who has stood with a bow in hand and a question lodged deep in the chest. Archery in its purest form teaches you a strange, unvarnished honesty, not the kind that boasts over a pint in the evening, the kind that bleeds a little in quiet moments, that listens to the resonance of the wood, the flight of the arrow, the thud of impact. You stand there, feet dug into the soft mud of a meath field or the worn mat of an indoor range, and when you pull back the string, you're pulling memory through sinew, bone, and breath. What lands is more than a forged point striking a target, its presence focused and unrepeatable, each shot a life unto itself, and still there's a quiet we never quite name, a stillness that settles in the marrow, the hush before the loosing, the breath held not in fear, though fear can be a sharpener of senses, but in something older, reverence, maybe, or a dread acknowledgement of consequence. It's here, in that suspended moment, the wound begins, not when the arrow strikes flesh or straw, but when it is summoned from the quiver, knocked, drawn, and committed to the air. Every shot, even the clean ones that find the gold, wounds something, if only the silence, if only the pristine face of the target, if only the archer's own store of finite breaths. That's the part we forget in our haste for the mark. The bow in its very shape is a beautiful contradiction, a study in potential, curved in peace, a gentle crescent, straightened, strained in tension, alive with stored energy, and yet we make it sing, this instrument of horn, sinew, and wood, often you, that tree of cemeteries and long life. We send pieces of ourselves into the world, feathered and fast, fletched with goose or swan, and they return in dreams or in the stories of others, or sometimes limp, broken, or in long, echoing silences. I've met men, old soldiers from forgotten skirmishes, who haven't drawn a bow in decades and still flinch at a sudden thunderclap, the sound too close to a volley loosed in anger. I've met women who whisper to the arrow before release, a quiet incantation, as if asking permission from the wind, from the spirit of the yew. Ritual, some might call it, or superstition, but I think it's recognition, a knowing that something is being given, something taken. There's no true distance in archery, not really, not in the soul of it. The arrow travels, yes, 100 yards, 200 even, a dark speck diminishing against the sky, but some part of the archer, some vital spark, stays with it, flies with it. It isn't just a tool of death or sport, though it has been both undeniably. It's a line of thought made visible, a philosophy carved in motion in the arc of its flight. And when it strikes, it does more than tear flesh or pierce a paper target. It reveals where we're tender, where our defences are thinnest. Take Henry V, Prince Hal before the weight of the crown and the blood of Agincourt settled upon him. At Shrewsbury in 1403, a battle against Hotspur's rebellion, an arrow, likely a bodkin, drove 6 inches into his young cheek, slipping beside the eye, a near-fatal kiss of iron. He lived, they say, ruled, triumphed. His surgeon, John Bradmore, a man of considerable ingenuity, recorded the extraction, using specially designed tongs, cleaning the wound with wine, and dressing it with honey, a testament to the practical art of healing in an age of brutality. But no one speaks of Henry's sleep in the years that followed. No one mentions the way his skin might have pulled tight in the damp English winter, or how every decision, every treaty signed, every order given, might have carried the phantom memory of that barbed intrusion, that whisper of mortality. A king's scar is a public wound, a reminder to all of the fragility that underpins power. It's the same memory, in a way, we inherit when we draw. Every archer, whether they know it or not, steps into a long, unbroken line of trembling, steadying hands. From the steppes of Asia, the Apache, whose arrows were extensions of spirit, to the Ainu of Hokkaido, whose reverence for the bear was matched by their skill with the bow. From the Anglo-Saxon furdman, with his simple longbow, to the samurai practicing Kyudo, the way of the bow, a discipline of mind and body. Each pulled the string with purpose, each offered the shot to something larger. Be it spirit, battle, ceremony, or the simple need to put food on the table, they loosed more than fletched wood. They loosed meaning into the air. In this way, Froissart's chronicle isn't mere witness, not just a dry accounting of fallen men. It's echo. It reverberates down the centuries, telling us that to shoot is to shape the future through fracture, through the violent assertion of will, that even retreat, like those Genoese crossbowmen, their pride shattered, their expensive bowstrings severed to render their weapons useless and hasten their flight, can be a form of prayer, a surrender not merely to defeat, but to the unbearable weight of meaning drawn from thin air and driven with such terrible force into the living body. And here we are, centuries on, still chasing that profound silence after the shot, still finding ourselves somehow in the shadow of that fall of arrows, that deadly snow. So I begin with this, the wound as invocation, the bow as oracle, its flex and recoil speaking a language older than words, and the arrow, the arrow, as the oldest kind of sentence, one that ends, perhaps, in blood or in the soft earth of the target, but begins always, always in breath. The wound, you see, does not end at the skin. That's a trick of the modern gaze, a convenience of our antiseptic age, where the closing of flesh, the neat suture, is mistaken for completion, for healing. But ask anyone who's ever carried a scar, not just the visible cicatrix on the body, but the invisible one etched in the quiet throb of thought, in the pathways of memory, and they'll tell you, the wound lives on. It changes shape, like a river finding new courses after a flood. It finds new ways to speak, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes in a shout that only the bearer can hear. In the monasteries of medieval France, places where script and silence met in the dim-lit cloisters and infirmaries, there's record, perhaps in some patient cartularium or monastic chronicle, of a brother who took an arrow to the thigh in, say, 1262, not in the grand theatre of battle, but in the woods, perhaps hunting for the abbey's table, or perhaps being hunted himself. The vellum is often maddeningly laconic on such vital human details. The wound, as they often did, blackened with infection. They brought leeches, those ancient little blood letters, ash poultices perhaps derived from sacred trees, vinegar-soaked cloth to cleanse. He survived the ink records. But for 5 years the entry continues. He limped, a visible testament to his encounter with mortality. And in the margin of the ledger, another monk, a brother scribe, dipped his quill and wrote, "Flebat ambulando, sed numquam orando." He wept when he walked, but never when he prayed. There it is again, isn't it? The silence beside the scar, a grief that does not wail for all the world to see, but waits and watches and endures. not out of some superhuman strength perhaps, but because of shape. Because some wounds become part of how you carry yourself through the world, not as a crushing weight, though they can be that too for a time, but as balance, a counterpoint to the unmarred self you once were. I've seen it in archers long past their prime, their shoulders stooped a little from years of other burdens, the way they hold a bow, not with the firm grip of youth, but with a kind of gentle reverence, like a memory given form, the way their eyes glaze, just a little, before each shot, as if asking the arrow to remember something they themselves can no longer quite articulate, the feeling a moment to face. We speak of draw weight and feather spine, of paradox and the archer's aim, but the heaviest thing an arrow carries is always meaning. In India, centuries before quill and parchment became common in these northern lands, the Sushruta Samhita, that astonishing compendium of medical knowledge, dating back perhaps to the 6th century BCE, offered not just a meticulous manual of extraction for embedded arrows, salya, but a profound reverence for the act, when to push the arrow through, when to attempt to pull it back, considering the barbza, the depth, the tissue involved, what prayers, what mantras to whisper, not merely as rote piety, but as an acknowledgement of the life force disturbed, what oils to warm sesame perhaps, or neem, honey for its sweetness and its well-documented antibacterial properties, ghee for its healing lubrication, but always, always, a word spoken, not just for the anxious patient, but for the wound itself, for the trauma it represented, as if to say, I see you, I acknowledge your presence. I know you did not arrive alone. You carry the intent of the archer, the history of the iron, the spirit of the shaft. For even then, with a wisdom we sometimes misplace, they understood. A wound is not necessarily a mark of failure, a sign of weakness. It's a passage, a place where the world broke in, and where, if one is fortunate, life reasserts itself, often changed, often stronger in the broken places, as the saying goes. Think again of Prince Henry, later the Lion of Agincourt, that figure of martial prowess, who took that dreadful bodkin arrow to the face at Shrewsbury. It drove deep behind his cheekbone, perilously close to the brain. His surgeon, the aforementioned John Bradmore, not only devised a specialized screw-threaded device to extract the arrowhead without causing further damage, but then bathed the raw cavity in wine, an antiseptic, and dressed it with honey and clean linen. Henry lived. But I wager that on certain wet autumn mornings, when the wind blew cold from the Welsh marches, his face sang quiet, aching hymns of iron and bone. The scar remained, a permanent reminder etched upon the royal visage, influencing perhaps how he was perceived, how he perceived himself. Pain remembers what politics, and even history books, often choose to forget, and still there is a profound silence in it, a silence that surrounds the memory, the scar, the story. Even now we shoot in manicured fields where no blood falls, at targets of straw or dense foam that do not flinch, that do not bleed, carbon shafts, aluminium arrows, precision engineered. It is cleaner, yes, more controlled, but something inevitably has been traded. Once every loosed arrow was a risk, a gamble with fate. Once to shoot was to wager memory, to engage in a dialogue with mortality itself. Among the Ainu of Japan, a people whose culture speaks of deep connection with the natural world, a bow is, or was, often blessed before it ever bent to an archer's will. The wood, the sinew, the very spirit of the tool, was acknowledged. Among the Apache, as with many indigenous peoples, an arrow was more than a projectile. It was a spirit path carrying intention and prayer. The draw is not mere mechanical motion, it is invocation. They shot not merely to kill game or an enemy, but to maintain balance, to participate in the sacred hoop of life, to give meaning to impact. Machiavelli, that cold and calculating Florentine in his art of war, praised the archer, seeing in him a type of the perfect instrument of state power, distant in operation, deliberate in aim, and devastating in effect. But even he, with his keen eye for the mechanics of power, missed something of the inner landscape. The arrow does not only wound the enemy, the target, it marks the archer. Each shot, loosed with intent, carves a fine line into the soul, a tally not of kills or points or victories, but a consequence of choices made visible. And sometimes the deepest wounds, the ones that ache with a peculiar persistence, are not made by presence, by the intrusive arrow, but by absence, by the space left behind. That's the one I carry most these days. The bow in the corner of my study, an old friend unvisited, its string gone slack with time and disuse. My hands, which once knew the familiar callus of the string, are given now more to the pen and the paper, to the shaping of words. Yet in the act of writing, especially when the current of thought runs strong and true, I feel the old tension return, a ghost in the muscles of my back and shoulders, the pull of breath before release, the phantom memory of impact, of the arrow finding its mark. I aim at silence now, at the blank page, hoping to fill it with some measure of meaning. And still, I know in some way I wound that silence, I disturbed that peace by the very act of inscription. There's a name for this quiet ache, though it's not often spoken in such gentle company. Grief, but not always for a tangible loss, not for a person gone or a battle lost. Sometimes it is a grief for transformation, for the self that was, and the self that is, and the unbridgeable distance between. We are stitched, all of us, with such griefs, such transformations. Some are our own, earned in the sharp encounters of our living. Others inherited, passed down through blood or story, like family heirlooms too heavy for words. So we carry them in our posture, in the cadence of our prayers, in the way our fingers might linger too long on an old, worn bowstring, feeling for a pulse that has long since faded, and still we shoot, or we find other ways to aim to loose. Because in the end, it is not solely the arrow striking its mark that changes us, nor the wound it might leave. It is what we become while watching it fly, in that breathless moment between release and arrival. It is the intention, the focus, the surrender to the physics of flight and the mysteries of impact. In the Danube Valley, archaeologists unearthed him, long before borders drew their taut, arbitrary lines across the skin of Europe. A skull, still strong in its essential curve, from a time when the world was younger, perhaps the Neolithic or early Bronze Age. It was split, or rather pierced, by a bronze arrowhead, expertly made, buried deep in the occipital bone. Not shattered, the report noted, not a glancing blow of rage, but entered. The kind of precise, deadly shot that spoke less of brute fury than of chilling skill, of fatal intention. The arrow lodged there like a final thought, a question left hanging, unfinished, in the silence of millennia. Elsewhere, on the wind-bitten steppes of Mongolia, a land that birthed nations of horse archers, they unearthed another story told in bone. A rib-cage from a warrior centuries gone, honeycombed by healed punctures, the arrowheads themselves long gone, but their passage marked by the body's tenacious repair. Wood, or perhaps bronze, turned to stone, or rather recorded in stone-like calcium in the slow patient furnace of time. This one survived. That's what stunned the researchers. 3 distinct wounds through the chest, another in the forearm, likely a defensive injury, a shield arm raised too late or not quite enough. And still he lived, for years maybe. Long enough for the bone to knit and smooth around the memory of trauma. Long enough perhaps to pass on a name, a story, a warning. Long enough to dream strange, arrow-haunted dreams under the vast indifferent stars. These are not mere relics, these bones. They are sentences paused mid-breath. Messages the past tried to send, half buried in the earth, half understood by us, their inheritors. And each arrowhead found lodged in ancient bone, each healed wound is a kind of punctuation, a comma in a life interrupted, a full stop brutal and final, or perhaps an ellipsis, suggesting a story that continued, forever altered. History, if read closely, with an ear for its silences as well as its proclamations, is not written only in the grand narratives of victories and empires. It is written in scars, individual and collective. And scars, I've found, do not tell a single simple story. They are palimpsests, layers of meaning, one written over another. What we see on the surface, what we're allowed to see, or what we choose to acknowledge, is often just the last layer, the most recent inscription. Beneath that, ritual perhaps, memory certainly. A hand trembling not from fear, but from knowing too well, from bitter experience, what's at stake with every drawn bow. Even Sun Tzu, in all his neat pragmatic calculations on warfare and the art of war, understood this deeper psychological dimension. He wrote of archers not just as soldiers dealing damage, but as force multipliers, not solely because of their accuracy, though that was prized, but because of the dread they instilled. An army can brace against a charge of infantry, he writes, or words to that effect. It can see the swords and spears. But how does it steel itself against an unseen shot, an arrow that comes from nowhere, that whispers death from a distance? The arrow removes your illusion of control, your comfortable sense of agency. It says you are not fast enough, not careful enough, not watchful enough, not enough, and so it wounds before it ever touches. It wounds the spirit, the certainty, the courage. There's something profoundly philosophical in that, isn't there? Something deeply existential. The wound as proof of limit, of vulnerability. The shaft in the side, real or metaphorical, as a moment where self meets edge, where the boundary of one's being is breached, and not always survives intact. But still, how elegant, how terribly beautiful the arrow is in its flight. A paradox of grace and lethality. Even in the Renaissance, when gunpowder and flame, the crude roar of the musket and cannon, began to replace the silent tension of sinew and feather, the arrow held a certain unique terror. Muskets boomed and smoked, announcing their presence with clumsy fury, but arrows whispered. They arrived not with the clap of thunder, but with the sound of breath, of parting air, a swish, a hush. and then if it found its mark, a sudden warmth, then a spreading cold, an intimacy far more cruel in its way than the impersonal blast of shot. Joachim du Bellay, the French poet of the Pléiade, a contemporary of Ronsard, once called the arrow, in a line that has always resonated with me, "La plume de Dieu, God's quill," a phrase that once read never quite left me. Because to be struck by an arrow in this light is not only to be harmed, to be physically pierced, it is to be written into, judged, engraved by a higher or at least another power, selected, and here we see the wound as text, the body as manuscript, vulnerable and receptive, the arrow as commentary, sharp and irrefutable, no clean erasure possible, just red ink, indelible, permanent. So we walk, all of us, with some sentence unfinished, some judgment recorded in the very marrow of our bones. Perhaps that's why archery, even in its modern, gentler forms, still calls to those of us who've lived a while with old pain, with the memory of our own piercings, not to relive the trauma, God forbid, but to trace its outline with care, with a kind of meditative attention, to offer, through the discipline of the shot, through the arc of the arrow, a kind of prayer for continuity, for coherence, for meaning to be found in the flight, not just the impact. In recent years I met a boy, 12 or so, he might have been, learning to shoot in a wind-lashed field up near Kildare, the air smelling of rain and sheep. He'd lost his mother the year before, a sudden cruel blow, and he spoke little, his words caught somewhere deep inside him. But every time he drew the small bow, every time he loosed an arrow towards the straw boss, he whispered her name. Not loudly, not for any audience, just a syllable, a breath sent forward, feathered and as steady as he could make it. I watched, and I knew, with a certainty that settles in the heart, that wasn't sport he was engaged in, that was communion, that was a way of keeping a conversation alive. We keep shooting, metaphorically, spiritually, sometimes even literally, not to conquer, but to remember, to mark where we were changed, where the world entered us, and to speak, through gesture, through ritual, through the focused intent of our gaze, what mere words will often not hold, cannot bear, and yet we keep shooting. Or we find our own equivalents, even as the boughs grow quiet in forgotten corners of attics and sheds, even as the strings fray and the bright fletchings fade, even as the quivers hang like ancient hollow relics, we return, maybe not with arrow in hand, not always, maybe with pen as I do now, or with silence, a deep attentive listening to the world, or with the deliberate stillness of observing, of waiting, but we return to that place of aim, of intention, because somewhere between the intake of breath and the controlled release, we remembered, if only for an instant, who we were when we first took aim, what mattered, what we were reaching for. That's the deepest wound sometimes, isn't it? The absence, the ghost of motion in the muscle, the echo of the string's release against the arm, the ache of the unloosed shot, the story untold, the truth unspoken. I've spent more years now, it seems, in thought and word than in the open field with you in hand. My bow, once calloused and familiar to my palm, sits idle, gathering dust, a sleeper in the corner. The limbs, I imagine, have relaxed into a kind of permanent slumber, their coiled energy quiescent. But when I write, especially on mornings like this, when the veil between worlds feels thin, it stirs. When I speak, or even think, of archery, of feather and bone, of the taut pull and the swift silent flight, something moves beneath the skin, a twinge, a faint echo, like the first subtle crack of thawed earth in spring, a wound waking not with pain, but with a kind of recognition. That, perhaps, is what all this is, this lifelong engagement with the imagery of the arrow and the wound. Not recovery, for some things are never fully recovered, but recognition. A constant, quiet acknowledgement of the marks life leaves upon us. There are men, I know, who walk without a visible limp, and yet their dreams are riddled with arrows, whistling past in the dark. There are women who smile warmly at gatherings, who manage households and careers with grace, but who still flinch inwardly at unseen flights, at sudden reminders of past hurts. Not all wounds are visible to the naked eye. Not all scars rise to the surface of the skin. But they're there in the small hesitations, in the learned overcorrections of behavior, in the quiet, unvoiced refusals to draw that particular bow again. The world, in its pragmatic bustle, often teaches us to hide these vulnerabilities, to present a smooth, unmarred surface. But archery, in its honest core, teaches something different, something truer. It teaches that to be wounded is not necessarily to be weak, but to be marked, to have been engaged with life at a profound level, to be part of a lineage older than carved stone, older than the first settlements, a lineage of those who aimed, knowing the risk, who loosed, knowing the potential cost. Among the old Irish tales, those stories that carry the scent of peat smoke and ancient sorrows, there's one I've fashioned in my mind from the fragments of many, of a bough carved from the wood of the very last tree of a sacred enchanted forest. It was said it could only be strung once, and its flight would be truer than any arrow ever loosed. The archer, a hero whose name changes with the teller, knew that the effort of stringing it, of drawing its immense power, would break his arm, would perhaps cost him his life, but he drew anyway. Not to win a war, for the battles were of a different kind then, not to fell a beast, for the beasts were part of the same fading magic, but because he had been asked, by forces unseen, to speak a final irrefutable truth, and the only language left to him, the only medium potent enough, was the arrow's flight from that singular bow. I think of that story often, of its stark, resonant beauty, especially now, in these times when truth itself often seems bartered and bent out of shape, when precision of thought and feeling is so often traded for the cacophony of noise and distraction. I think of that archer who loosed his arrow despite the certainty of the break, who spoke finally and fully, through pain, through sacrifice. And I think of the young lad in the field near Kildare, whispering his mother's precious name into the flight of every arrow, a feathered prayer, and the monk in the mediaeval scriptorium, who wept while walking his daily rounds but found solace, or perhaps a different kind of expression, when he prayed, and those Genoese mercenaries at Crécy, blinded by a storm of English shafts, cutting their own bowstrings in a desperate gesture that was both surrender and a strange kind of salvation. And of myself too, sitting here in a quiet room, the scent of old books and fresh ink around me, remembering the profound, demanding weight of the draw. This, then, is how we carry our wounds, if we are to carry them with any grace at all. Not as badges of shame or defeat, but as scripture, as lived text. They are not healed, no, not always in the sense that they vanish without a trace. Healing in that sense suggests an end, a closure that life seldom grants so neatly. But some stories, some wounds, aren't meant to close completely. They are meant to be held, to be tended like a low flame through a long night, to be passed down in gesture, in art, in the telling of tales. So here's to the arrowheads still buried deep in ancient bone, speaking their silent, eloquent testimonies, to the wind that hums like old, half-forgotten hymns across the empty fields where battles were once fought, where lives were changed in an instant, to the hands that sometimes shake, not from fear, not any more, but from the sheer weight of memory, to the feathered syllables of grief and of grace loosed into the uncertain air. To you, reader, who have journeyed with me this far, may your own wounds, seen and unseen, be named, be acknowledged in the quiet sanctuary of your own heart. May your stories be shaped not by the silence that followed the impact, but by the deep, steadying breath that came before the loosing. And when the time comes for you to aim, and it will in ways great and small, may you draw your bow, may you sight your mark, and may you release your arrow knowing full well, and with a calm spirit, what it carries, a history, yours and those who came before, a reckoning with the world and with yourself, a piece of you irretrievably given, and all the silent watching ghosts who stand beside you, nodding slowly as you let it fly.